Hey, on this edition of Southern Crash Kings, we're continuing this rebuild on this Jeep Wrangler JK Rubicon. Now, up to this point, I've walked you through buying this Jeep, doing the initial teardown, buying the first Rubicon parts Jeep, which is a 15 model, buying the second parts Jeep, which is a 13 model Sport, and now this Jeep is roadworthy. But there's one more thing I want to do to it. Stay tuned and I'll tell you what that is. Okay, so now that the Jeep is roadworthy, one thing I always like to do is to drive a freshly rebuilt vehicle just in its stock trim, just to kind of get a baseline for fuel mileage, just kind of performance, how it handles, all that stuff. And so that particular Wrangler, I drove it for several months with stock wheels, stock tires, and that sort of thing. And surprisingly, combined highway and city, I was getting 16, 17 miles per gallon. So if you've had any of the TJ Wranglers or the YJs, you know to get 16 or 17 miles per gallon is about unheard of for those older Jeeps. So no complaints with this Wrangler on the fuel mileage. But as I mentioned, there was one more thing that I wanted to do to this Jeep Wrangler. And what was it? I wanted to take the lift from Parts Jeep number 1, that 15 Wrangler Rubicon that had the TerraFlex 4-inch suspension lift, and I wanted to put it on this Jeep Wrangler. Now, the 13 model Wrangler had a 2.5-inch lift on it, but it was a rough country lift, and nothing against rough country, but if you have rough country or TerraFlex side by side, the TerraFlex was nearly a $4,000 lift. So that's what I wanted to go with. Now, one thing I didn't like, on the 15 model Rubicon, those 37s, Goodyear Wranglers, those are just too big a tire, too aggressive for what I wanted to run on this. And honestly, I would have a hard time clearing those 37s without installing the flat fenders, and I wanted to keep the factory fender flares on this Jeep. Now, on the 13 model, it had basically a stock Hoth tire, but it was just a 10.5-inch tire on some Mickey Thompson wheels. I really didn't like the wheels on that particular Wrangler, and the tires were just too small. So what does that mean? I got to go back to the auction. So once again, night after night, looking for the perfect Wrangler that has the wheels and tires that I wanted. Now, if you know much about wheels and tires on Wranglers, there is your stock wheel, which is about 7-8 inches wide, and then you can go to like a 9-inch wide wheel in aftermarket, or you can go to a 10-inch wide wheel in the aftermarket world, and of course you can go wider than that. But for what I like, if you go with a 9-inch wheel, that tire doesn't set out far enough for just my personal preference. You really got to go with a 10-inch wide wheel. Now, most people that put lifts on them don't go with a 10-inch wide wheel. So that made it extremely difficult to try to find a wheel and tire combination that I liked that was in that 10-inch width, and I wanted to go with a 20-inch diameter. Now, granted, some guys, they like the 17-inch or the 18-inch wheels on it. I have nothing against that. But for this particular Wrangler, I just wanted to go with a 20-inch. I thought that with the 4-inch lift, blacked out, was a good combination. So went out on the hunt, and finally I found it down in Atlanta, Georgia. This is a 2011 Wrangler Sport. Had a little over 100,000 miles on it. It was actually all black. It looked very similar to this Jeep, but I could tell from the pictures those were 20-inch wheels, 10 inches wide. They set out a little bit farther than most Jeeps I had been seeing, and they had the BF Goodrich all-terrain tires that looked practically brand new. And if you've ever had those BF Goodrich all-terrain tires, they're a great tire for just an aggressive look, but they're really quiet on the road, even in a 1250 width. So I knew I had to buy that Jeep, but it was just a matter of how much was I going to pay for it. So it turns out, as I mentioned earlier, the older you go, the cheaper they get. So this particular Wrangler, the final bid was $5,900. So I was a winner. So I hopped in the truck, hooked the trailer, head to Atlanta. Now, when I first get there, I have to wait quite a while. This is at a Copart location in Atlanta. And they finally bring the Wrangler out. And the first thing I notice is the front wheels are just doing this right here. And what that tells me, the front suspension, drag link, tie rod, something is broke big time. And I'm just praying that there's no damage to the wheels or tires. So I set it down in the trailer, and I give it a good look. Really couldn't care less what the body's like. Inside, I just need wheels and tires. And I'm shocked to find out there's not one scratch on any of the 5 wheels, and the tires are brand new. They still have the little ears on them that wear off within 500 miles. That's gone. So these tires are brand new, and I could not be more happy with that purchase. So bring it back and get in the shop and get those wheels and tires off for the lift install. Now, with the parts Jeep number 1, the 15 Rubicon, it had that oversized wheel carrier on the back. Whoever installed it didn't install it correctly, and the bolts were loose, and it had a lot of wear, and it was just not in very good condition. So this 11 Wrangler, the third parts Jeep that I just bought, it had that exact same Smitty-built rear bumper on it with a much better spare tire carrier on the back. So I also pulled that spare tire carrier off of it. And that, with the wheels and tires, will complete the rebuild on this Wrangler. So one Saturday, I tore into the front suspension on this thing. Now, before I did the suspension lift, I like to paint my control arms and coil springs gunmetal gray. You get it at most of your home improvement stores. And it can be a little tricky to find it in a gloss. Makes it clean up good, makes it look a little better underneath the Jeep. So what I ended up doing is finding some gunmetal gray in a flat, and then did some clear coat and painted all the springs and control arms and got all those ready to go before I installed the lift. Now, installing the lift, I did not have, again, a lift to get the body up off the ground. I was thinking this Wrangler would be so easy to install a lift, and granted, it's not super difficult, but there is a ton of bolts that you got to take loose to put a lift on this Wrangler. So I ended up coming in on a Saturday and did the rear end first, and then coming back another day and doing the front end. But I must say, the lift, the wheels and tires was the perfect combination for this Wrangler and was exactly what I was looking for. I also ended up having to put an aftermarket steering stabilizer shock system on the front axle. I was getting some wobble in the steering wheel now with these oversized tires, and so actually parts Jeep number 1 had that aftermarket steering stabilizer system on it. It was just the shocks were burnt, so I cleaned up the brackets, bought new shocks, put that on, and that took care of any sort of death wobble in the steering. Maybe you guys have experienced that as well. So now that the Wrangler has a lift on it, got to go back and get another alignment, and then now just got to put the spare tire carrier on it, and that was not terribly difficult. It did require taking the rear bumper back off and installing that spare tire carrier, and then I was able to put the aftermarket wheel and tire back there and really complete this Jeep Wrangler rebuild. Now, with those wheels and tires, I did lose about 2 miles per gallon and averaging about 14 miles per gallon combined city and highway. So I sacrificed a little bit of fuel mileage, but exactly what I was wanting look-wise, and I'm fine with that. And these tires and wheel combination are super quiet and have no issues there. Handle great traction. Okay, so that wraps up the Jeep Wrangler build. That takes you from the concept, the idea, all the way through the rebuild process. Now, as I said many times, at Southern Crash Kings, we do things a little differently and buy as many parts Jeeps as we need to rebuild this. Now, I understand you're going to be in a different situation. So, in the very first video, I talked about how much money would it cost, how much money could you save if you decided to buy one of these salvage vehicles and rebuild them. And so, I have the numbers. So when you buy a vehicle at auction, you have your final bid price, but then there's some auction fees that have to be tacked onto that. And that varies just based on the sale price. So to buy this Jeep Wrangler at auction with those auction fees, my total out the door cost was $9,363. Okay. Again, it was worth about $36,000 when I bought it, this Wrangler. So factor in some fuel costs going and getting it. Maybe if you have to pay somebody to haul the vehicle, transportation costs, you can tack that on to your number. So in addition to that, you would have to buy all the parts that I used off of these parts Wranglers that I bought. So if you had to go buy all those parts, especially if you wanted to replace the frame and then go from there, because this being a Rubicon model, you're probably going to have close to $10,000 in parts. The front axle alone is about $3,000 to buy one of those used. Certainly you can find good deals shopping around, but keep in mind, if you are going through a rebuild process with your state, you've got to have documentation, receipts, VIN numbers, all that stuff to turn in. So it really limits who you can buy from if they can't provide that documentation on the parts. Now, you always have some miscellaneous fees, like I mentioned. You got your obvious body work that had to be done. You've got AC's got to be charged. You got fluids, you got alignments, stuff like that. So that could run another $3,000-$4,000, maybe $5,000, depending on where you live. So if you were to buy this Jeep Wrangler, just like I did, and rebuild it, buy all the parts, and use your labor, maybe outsource the body shops, you're probably gonna have $22,000, maybe $23,000 in this Jeep. So how much would that save you? Well, you could do the math, $14,000, $15,000. So these Wranglers, they're more expensive to rebuild than most of your vehicles. The parts are more expensive. Overall, to buy them is a little bit more expensive. So you just have to be the judge if it's worth doing all that work to save $14,000, $15,000. Now, if you're like me, I love the challenge. I love getting in there and taking something and bringing it back to life. So for me, it's worth it. But you can make the call. All right, so that wraps up this Jeep Wrangler. I've walked you through the process of rebuilding it, showed you the numbers, and now it's up to you. Maybe you want to tackle rebuilding one of these Wranglers or some other salvage or total vehicle, but that will help you with determining the cost and then also the process. Okay, so we got one more thing to finish up this Jeep Wrangler build. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, are you going to actually show us a Jeep? And the answer is yes. Check it out. A 2017 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, 29,000 miles. This Jeep, 4-inch TerraFlex suspension lift. It's got BF Goodrich all-terrain tires, 35 1250s, mounted to a 20 by 10-inch wheel. I appreciate you watching the videos. Please like, please share the videos, but most importantly, subscribe. You haven't seen the last of this Jeep. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.